You think skincare is expensive now? Imagine slaughtering over 600 girls just to smooth your wrinkles. Meet Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the real-life vampire of Hungary, who believed virgin blood was the secret to eternal youth. For over 20 years, she tortured, mutilated, and drained young peasant girls in her remote castle. And here's the real horror. No one stopped her. Not because she hid it well, but because her victims were poor. She was rich, royal, and untouchable, until her crimes became too gruesome to ignore. By the end of this video, you'll wonder how many monsters history quietly forgave. Let's plunge in. You're a 14-year-old peasant girl in 1600s Hungary. You're told Countess Báthory is hiring, maybe as a maid, maybe a seamstress. It's a rare chance. Her castle is rich, and her court is elite. So you pack your things and head toward Chaktiche Castle, a towering stone fortress nestled in the mountains. You never come back. Hundreds of girls disappeared this way, literally vanished, and their families? They were peasants. No one in power listened. Why would they? Elizabeth Báthory wasn't just noble, she was royalty. Niece to the King of Poland, cousin to the Prince of Transylvania, one of the richest, most protected women in Eastern Europe. Inside the castle, things were far darker than anyone could imagine. Survivors, and yes, a few actually escaped, told stories of chains, whips, and iron torture devices, of cold chambers echoing with screams. One girl said she was stripped naked, tied up, and slashed until her blood pooled beneath her feet. And the Countess, she watched, calmly sipping wine. But this wasn't punishment. It was a ritual. According to servants, Elizabeth believed blood, specifically the blood of virgins, could keep her young. It wasn't metaphorical. She literally bathed in it. And the worst part? She was just getting started. Forget potions. Forget prayers. Countess Báthory had one belief: virgin blood reversed aging. According to her closest maids, the Countess became obsessed with her appearance in her 30s. One day, a servant girl accidentally tugged her hair while brushing it. Elizabeth struck her so hard, the girl's nose bled, splattering droplets on her mistress's hand. The Countess stared. She swore the skin where the blood landed looked younger, softer, more radiant. That's when the transformation began. From vain noblewoman to full-blown butcher. She had the girl stripped, strung up, and drained. Then came the bath. Warm blood poured into the tub, and Elizabeth stepped in like royalty at a spa. Her maids were forced to scrub her skin, massaging it in as if it were lotion. And this became routine. Peasant girls were lured to the castle with promises of work. They never left. Their blood fed Elizabeth's vanity. If the skin on her neck sagged, she'd order a girl killed. If her hands looked wrinkled, she'd choose another. Some were mutilated alive so she could watch the blood pour fresh. One diary entry from a priest called it a ritual of crimson rejuvenation. Today we call it psychosis. Back then it was indulgence, a deadly one, and it would escalate even further. Most killers hide their violence. Elizabeth flaunted hers. Inside her castle was a chamber, later dubbed the Blood Room, where tools of terror were crafted with purpose. There were cages rigged with spikes, iron maidens lined with razors, and a device allegedly designed just to bite chunks of flesh from thighs and shoulders. Witnesses said she didn't scream at the blood. She smiled. One servant testified that the Countess enjoyed slicing open girls between their toes because it bled slowly. She'd bite off pieces of flesh with her own teeth. She'd freeze girls naked outside in the snow, then pour cold water over them until they became statues of ice. But here's the twist. She didn't always kill right away. Sometimes she'd keep them alive, bandaging wounds, feeding them just enough to heal, so she could torture them again. Like a twisted beauty regimen, a living supply chain, and the court didn't blink. Local officials and nobles whispered rumors, sure, but Elizabeth was family, royal. Arresting her would mean challenging one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. So they looked away, and the blood continued to flow. By this point, the body count wasn't dozens, it was in the hundreds. But Elizabeth had one more terrifying idea: building her own school for victims. You thought she was just picking girls off the street? Think again. Elizabeth Báthory created a literal academy to lure her victims. She opened a so-called finishing school for noble girls, offering to educate them in etiquette, dance, and courtly manners. The daughters of lesser aristocrats came willingly. After all, who wouldn't want their daughter trained by a countess? But this wasn't a school. It was a slaughterhouse. These weren't peasants. These were girls with bloodlines and family names, and even they weren't safe. Reports from survivors, few and terrified, described nights when the halls echoed with screams. Girls were pulled from their beds, forced into the blood room. Some were beaten until their bones snapped. Others were burned with hot coins or stabbed with needles under their fingernails. When they vanished, Elizabeth wrote letters to their families claiming illness, suicide, or melancholy fits. She even sent forged death certificates. What makes this phase even darker? Her assistants. Yes, she had help. 4 main accomplices, including a female servant named Dorothea Sentes, known as the Witch. They helped restrain the girls, dispose of the bodies, and clean the blood-soaked floors. It was organized, systematic, and entirely protected by her title. But the walls of Countess Castle were growing thin. Blood has a smell, and it was starting to leak into the air. Imagine living downhill from hell. That's what it was like near Countess Castle. Locals began noticing the smell. Rotting meat, decay. It drifted down the mountainside, carried by the wind. And the rumors, already swirling for years, turned into accusations. One farmer swore he saw a cart filled with sacks of limbs. Another claimed he heard screams echoing from the castle late at night. A few brave parents began demanding answers after their daughters never arrived at Elizabeth's school. But here's the real shock. The authorities already knew. The king himself, Matthias II of Hungary, had received reports about Báthory's atrocities, but she was nobility. To arrest her would trigger a political firestorm, so instead, they did nothing. For years. It wasn't until Elizabeth started targeting young noblewomen, girls with names and dowries, that the system finally cracked. A few high-ranking families, furious over the disappearances, demanded an investigation. But even then, it had to be discreet, private, political. So the king sent Count György Thurzó, a trusted ally and distant relative, to investigate under the guise of a family visit. On December 29, 1610, he arrived at Countess Castle. What he found inside would become legend. It should have been quiet, just a friendly visit. Instead, Count Thurzó walked into a bloodbath. According to court records, he entered the castle with guards and immediately heard a scream. Not just a scream, but a plea. Following the sound, they reached the torture chamber and saw it. A girl, still alive, hanging upside down, her throat partially slit. Another lay nearby, dead. A third whimpered in the corner, covered in gashes. And in the center of it all, Countess Báthory standing in a crimson-stained gown, caught, not by rumor, not by hearsay, but in the act. Thurzo's men searched the castle. They found more bodies, some buried in shallow graves, others stuffed into chests or under floorboards. The final count? Over 50 mutilated corpses in various stages of decomposition. And that was just what they could see. Elizabeth didn't panic, didn't scream. She reportedly looked at Thurzo and said, "What do you expect? These girls displeased me." That's not madness. That's entitlement. And it's here the story takes a strange turn. Because even now, with overwhelming evidence, they didn't execute her. Why? Because she was nobility. They couldn't afford the scandal of a public trial, so instead, they buried her alive. Sort of. They didn't drag her through the streets. They didn't burn her at the stake. Instead, Elizabeth Báthory was quietly placed under house arrest, in her own castle. That's right. No trial, no public execution. Just 4 walls and locked doors. The woman accused of butchering over 600 girls got to sleep in her own bed. Because aristocracy has its privileges, even for monsters. But don't think this was a gentle punishment. Her prison was sealed. Workers bricked up her chambers, leaving only small holes for food and waste. She lived in darkness, surrounded by stone. No sunlight, no visitors, no servants to fan her or brush her blood-soaked hair. She went from bathing in virgin's blood to rotting in her own filth. And yet, she remained Countess Báthory. Her title was never officially stripped. Her lands and wealth were divided quietly among her relatives, who lobbied hard to protect the family name. Even her accomplices, those who had tied the ropes, swung the whips, disposed of the bodies, received far harsher punishment. Some were executed, others mutilated, but not Elizabeth. Because in the end, her real crime wasn't murder. It was embarrassing the nobility. The state needed her gone, but not ruined. She died in silence on August 21st, 1614, after 4 years bricked inside her castle room. Elizabeth Báthory was found slumped on the floor. The guards claimed she had complained of cold the night before. By morning, she was dead. No grand reckoning, no final confession, no justice. And here's the disturbing part. There was no autopsy, no official cause of death. Her body was quickly removed and buried, first in Chaktiche, then reportedly moved to a secret location to avoid vandalism. Because even in death, the Countess was protected. No one wanted the world to remember that the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history had blue blood. No one wanted a scandal that would stain generations of aristocracy. So her records were sealed, her name buried, and for centuries she became more legend than history. But behind the Dracula myths, behind the vampire tales, there's cold fact. She killed, methodically, systematically, with the help of dozens, with the silence of hundreds. And the question that still haunts historians? Why did no one stop her sooner? That's the number carved into legend. But even that might be an understatement. During the investigation, one servant testified under oath that she had personally seen a list kept by Elizabeth, a black ledger of every girl killed. The number? 650 names. Unfortunately, the list disappeared. Some say it was burned by relatives. Others believe it was confiscated by the crown and locked away. But we have witness statements, court records, testimonies from more than 300 people, servants, guards, local villagers, each describing different victims, different methods, different nights. Some say the true toll was even higher. Girls buried in forest pits, dumped in rivers, burned in castle furnaces. And here's the horrifying thought. Many of these girls were so poor, so unimportant in the eyes of the elite, that their names were never recorded. No one went looking for them. They were never missed by the powerful. Modern serial killers rarely claim more than a dozen victims before being caught. Elizabeth Báthory may have killed 50 times that and lived in luxury while doing it. Her reign of horror wasn't some crime of passion. It was a career, a sadistic system of murder enabled by fear, silence, and aristocracy. And yet, some still debate if she even existed. Here's the real twist. After her death, people tried to make her the victim. Some historians, especially in the 19th century, argued that Elizabeth Báthory had been framed, that she was too powerful, too rich, and too independent for the fragile male egos around her, that the investigation was a political hit job. After all, they say, there was no trial, no confession, just accusations from peasants and rivals. But let's be clear, over 300 testimonies, many from nobles and castle staff, describe in detail what happened inside Chakticha. Survivors had matching scars. Relatives identified clothing from missing daughters. One priest confessed he had buried dozens of bodies with his own hands. And those who say maybe it wasn't that bad, they're ignoring a brutal truth. History loves to protect the powerful. Rewrite, reframe, repackage. Today we do it with celebrities, politicians, CEOs. Back then, it was countesses. And the people who rewrite these stories often don't care about the victims, just the drama, the mystery. The idea that maybe she was misunderstood. But if Elizabeth Báthory was innocent, who killed the girls? Because someone did, hundreds of them. And they weren't hallucinations. They were flesh and blood. Forget Dracula. He's fiction. Elizabeth Báthory? She was real. And she makes Dracula look like a bedtime story. Her story inspired the 18th century vampire craze. Writers like Bram Stoker borrowed her cruelty, her baths of blood, her remote castle in the Carpathians. Some even say she was the original bloodsucker, the first real vampire in European lore. But unlike Dracula, she didn't need fangs, just knives, just chains, just absolute power. What makes her so terrifying isn't just the gore, it's the normalcy of her privilege, the way the system protected her, how hundreds of girls could die in the open, and the courts turned a blind eye. We want monsters to be obvious, fanged, clawed, other. But Elizabeth Báthory wore silk gowns, attended royal banquets, spoke Latin, and killed for skin care. What does that say about civilization? That the scariest monsters don't live in shadows. They live in castles, surrounded by servants, smiling at banquets while girls scream behind stone walls. She didn't just bathe in blood. She bathed in silence. Let's not forget what this really was. A power system that fed on the powerless. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't some rogue killer. She was a symptom of a rotten structure. A society where noblewomen could own entire villages, where poor girls were disposable, where justice bent to bloodlines. She used her wealth to lure, her name to protect, her castle to imprison, and the silence of others to keep killing. And the church? The monarchy? They didn't stop her out of morality. They stopped her when she became embarrassing. Today, we like to think we've changed. But ask yourself, how many powerful predators still walk free because of their money, their name, or the silence around them? How many girls, then and now, are sacrificed to protect the reputation of a system built on control? Elizabeth Báthory died behind stone. But her story is still walking, whispering, reminding us that evil doesn't wear horns. It wears a crown and smiles. From peasant girls strung up like cattle to noble daughters drained behind closed doors, Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror was soaked in blood and silence. We began with a rumor, just a countess obsessed with beauty. But now you've seen the truth. She wasn't just vain. She was a machine of death, wrapped in silk, protected by bloodlines, and fueled by a system that saw poor girls not as people, but as parts. Parts to be used, cut, bled, burned, forgotten. This wasn't some isolated act of madness. It was a factory of cruelty, one that operated in plain sight with staff, structure, and support. For over 20 years, Elizabeth didn't hide. She invited the victims in. And what stopped her? Not morality, not justice, not conscience. It was scandal. It wasn't the screams that broke the silence. It was that she finally hurt the wrong class of girl. It took noble blood to expose the death pit she had built from peasant corpses. And when the truth came out, they didn't destroy her. They quietly erased her, bricked her into her castle, buried her records, pretended it hadn't happened. Because Countess Báthory wasn't the only thing that needed to disappear. So did the shame of everyone who let it happen. So what's the takeaway? What's the real horror here? It's not just what Elizabeth did. It's how easily a system let it happen, and how eerily familiar that still feels today. Think about it. Powerful people exploiting the weak, using status to avoid consequences, buying silence, weaponizing beauty, and when they're finally caught, a slap on the wrist, a quiet exit, a Netflix documentary, and then we move on. How many modern Elizabeth Bathory's walk among us right now? The celebrities, the CEOs, the cult leaders, the politicians, the billionaires. How many girls disappeared behind velvet doors? How many monsters are only stopped when their crimes make the rich uncomfortable? Elizabeth's story is history's mirror, and what it shows isn't ancient, it's repeating. Because even now, we struggle to believe women can be monsters, especially beautiful ones, especially noble ones. We excuse. We romanticize. We mythologize. She couldn't have done that. She's too elegant. She was misunderstood. Maybe they made it up. It's the same story, over and over again. But here's the truth. The worst evil often wears a perfect face. Elizabeth Báthory didn't just bathe in blood. She bathed in denial. In centuries of people choosing not to look. But you just looked. And now you know. 600 girls, probably more, lost in history. Not warriors, not nobles, just girls with dreams, with names never recorded, whose only mistake was being born poor near a castle. They deserve more than silence. They deserve remembrance. And Countess Báthory? She deserves more than myth. She deserves to be remembered for what she really was. A killer, a torturer, a creature so grotesque that even history tried to erase her. But not anymore. So here's the final question. Which modern figure, protected by fame, power, or status, will we one day discover had their own castle of horrors? And when that truth comes out, will we bury them? Or brick them into silence, just like we did her? Let us not make the same mistake again. Comment below the part that shocked you the most. Was it the bloodbaths? The finishing school trap? The political cover-up? Like this video if you're glad you weren't born in 1600. And subscribe for more brutally honest history, because what's buried always comes back. Next up, the virginity inspections of medieval queens and the proof displayed to the public. You don't want to miss it.